Welcome to the Walden Watch, a marine invasive species podcast. I am your host, Reginald Walden. I am a senior at the University of New Haven, majoring in marine biology with a minor in communications. In this series, we're going to be talking about invasive species, what they are, how they spread, how they impact the environment and economy, ways they are being managed, and what you can do to stop their spread. In this episode, we're going to explore how invasive species have traveled throughout the world. We'll be discussing hitchhiking animals and international shipping, some of my most environmentally irresponsible online shopping sessions, and barely understood communities of prehistoric animals in imminent threat of extinction. When I was a kid, one of my favorite books was MVP, Magellan Voyage Project, by Douglas Evans. It's about a 12-year-old boy named Adam Story, who takes part in a contest to circumnavigate the world in 40 days without air travel. It's largely inspired by Jules Verne's 1873 novel Around the World in 80 Days, which also inspired people in real life to circumnavigate the globe in even shorter periods of time. These real and fictional circumnavigations demonstrate just how much smaller the world has become. Before Jules Verne's day, Phineas Fogg's quest to circumnavigate the globe within 80 days was almost unthinkable. People even laughed at it when he first proposed it. However, the Suez Canal, Great Indian Peninsular Railway, and Transcontinental Railroad made it possible. An MVP, going around the world in 40 days, could only be a challenge when aircraft were removed from the equation. The world, however, didn't just get smaller for humans. Numerous hitchhikers have joined us on the way. From the early voyages of the Age of Discovery to modern casual transoceanic journeys, marine invasive species have hidden on our hulls, fishing gear, and ballast water. Our global trade also introduced some of the fiercest, hardiest marine life for aquaculture and aquariums to new habitats throughout the world. Jules Verne would be amazed by the technological networks we have created today. And as a man of science who studied the wonders of ocean life in preparation for writing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, be horrified by its unintended results on marine life throughout the globe. Humans have been trading in exotic species and intentionally transporting them since ancient times. The ancient Romans had a great love of exotic beasts, especially for watching them tear each other apart. Merchants and politicians seeking to placate the populace with bread and circuses. Along with their penchant for displaying terrestrial animals, Romans also invented the first indoor aquariums. They were, unlike their amphitheaters, modest, consisting of small marble tanks kept under guest beds. When glass was invented in 50 AD, tanks with one glass wall could be created, allowing Romans to get better views of their fish. Romans also made outdoor marine ponds as status symbols, and controlled salinity in them by adding fresh water. Cicero and Augustus both condemned these ponds as useless luxuries. Transporting exotic animals like elephants and tigers was already a difficult practice, but for Romans, bringing marine species from one place to another was almost impossible. The only fish they kept in indoor aquariums were native sea barbels, a type of marine catfish. Modern aquariums with exotic Amazonian or reef fish were unthinkable to an ancient Roman. Aquariums as we know them today would not be invented until the 19th century. In the 1840s, marine zoologist Anne Thyn created the first balanced marine quote-unquote aquatic vivarium in London, in which she maintained live stony corals and seaweed for 3 years. Anne Thyn's achievements in keeping coral inspired renowned naturalists and marine biologist Philip Henry Goss to design and popularize quote-unquote aquariums, a word he coined to replace aquatic vivarium, which is a mouthful. Inventions of the post-war era, such as plastic bags and silicone sealants, made shipping of exotic fish much easier. The invention of the internet allowed for easier purchasing and shipping of exotic species. While I was conducting research for this podcast, I found websites selling live lionfish for aquariums, which never mentioned their role as an invasive species or warned against releasing them into the wild. These websites also gave extensive instructions on treatment of lionfish stings and caring for lionfish, so the lack of warnings seems like a glaring omission. No, I'm not going to say what websites they are. I don't want to give anyone ideas. The aquarium trade also happens informally on social media sites such as Facebook. A survey which examined online fish trading in Brazil revealed aquarists selling non-native aggressive fish such as spotted gar, peacock bass, largemouth bass, and fine-scale tigerfish. These fish were all sold as juveniles and can sometimes grow 7.5 times their size at sale. Arapaima gigas, or piraku, is one of the largest freshwater fish in the world, capable of growing longer than 10 feet and weighing over 400 pounds. I have also found websites selling juvenile arapaima without warning people of their adult size. This is a serious concern because aquarists underestimating a fish's adult size or needs often leads to aquarium dumping. This is when pet owners release their fish into nearby streams, rivers, lakes, or the sea. Aquarium dumping is the main cause of non-native fish introduction in Australia, Taiwan, Singapore, and Japan. One of the world's most troublesome and devastating invasive species, the lionfish, was likely introduced off the coast of Florida by the pet trade. In our next segment, we're going to discuss how the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles caused a biological invasion. Along with fish, the pet trade also brings many invasive reptile and amphibian species all over the globe. Similar to the case with fish, many inexperienced pet owners underestimate the size a pet they purchased as a baby will grow to when they become an adult. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were one of the world's largest entertainment franchises, delighting children and confusing adults. In 1990, they got their first live-action film, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The popularity of this film led to an explosion in demand of pet turtles among children, especially in the United Kingdom. In the late 1980s, about 33,000 red-eared sliders were imported to the UK. In the early 1990s, 250,000 were imported. Red-eared sliders are the most popular pet turtle in the world. They were often sold as tiny, adorable hatchlings smaller than a quarter. The pet owners often underestimated their size as adults and their required upkeep. When children lost interest in the turtles, which, to their dismay, cannot do martial arts or talk like a surfer, their parents often disposed of them. Some unlucky turtles were flushed down the toilet or killed. Some lucky turtles were abandoned into unlucky waterways and ponds. In Britain, these aggressive invasive species ate ducklings, water plants, amphibians, and other native species, which upset local ecosystems. They also outcompeted the European pond turtle, an endangered species, albeit an introduced and non-invasive one in the United Kingdom. In 2014, the release of a rebooted Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film ignited fears of a new wave of reckless animal neglect and turtle releases in Britain and America, as new children would be introduced to the franchise. Charities like the American Tortoise Rescue and the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or RSPCA, warned parents not to purchase pet turtles for their children because of the animal welfare concerns for the turtles and environmental concerns for the local ecosystem. They also warned of the danger small turtles pose in spreading salmonella, which is one of the reasons it is illegal to sell small turtle hatchlings as pets. While the red-eared slider remains a disturbingly popular pet among children, many more formidable invasive species work their way through the pet market. Exotic reptiles like the Burmese python, Argentine tegu, and Nile monitor are invasive in Everglades National Park in Florida. The subtropical wetlands of the Everglades make good habitat for these reptiles from South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. According to the Rutgers University study, for exotic pets, the most popular are also most likely to be released in the wild. The pet trade is the largest vector of reptilian and amphibian invasions. The study examined economic data on reptiles and amphibians sold in the United States and found species with a high probability of being released by their owners have a relatively large adult mass and were cheaper on retail. This compounds the problems shown by the red-eared slider in Britain. Cheap impulse purchases of animals which eventually grow too large for their owners to handle. It's a perfect combination of factors for a biological invasion. In our next segment, I'm going to debunk some myths about the internet's favorite crustacean. Aquariums are artificial ecosystems, and as ecosystems, they can still be subject to biological invasion. Maintenance of an aquarium includes considering not only the fish, but also the aquatic plants, algae, invertebrates, and, if saltwater, coral. This is something a lot of unfortunate parents discovered after their kids begged for an aquarium after watching Finding Nemo. Aquarium pests sneak in through shipments of food, water, and coral. Sometimes, they do so as microscopic eggs or planktonic larvae, which often happens with snails. These pests could be considered invasive species because they harm the aesthetic qualities of the tank. In this case, one considers an aquarium pest. It is subjective. Snails are usually considered pests, but one of my college friends bonded to a large snail which established itself in his tank, even giving it a name. One of the most iconic aquarium pests are mantis shrimps. Members of the order Stomatopoda, these crustaceans are aggressive predators which live in burrows and get shipped in via shipments of coral. They get their name from their front claws, which are folded in a similar way to a terrestrial praying mantis. When extended, these claws can be the length of the rest of their body, and at the end of their claws are either sharp appendages for spearing prey, which closely resemble a praying mantis's front legs, or club-like ones for crushing shells. These club-like appendages can hit with the force of a .22 caliber bullet and break aquarium glass. Engineers and scientists are studying their carapace, or shell, for potential applications in making stronger micro-robots. They have accrued a fierce reputation online, popularized by webcomics and pop science videos which celebrate their ferocity and strength. Their aggressive behavior gets them portrayed as cold-blooded, efficient arbiters of destruction against any and all marine life. These depictions often exaggerate and sometimes misinform about the mantis shrimp's ability to see color. While they have 12 color receptors instead of our 3 color receptors, they have trouble discerning between colors, even between ones humans can see. While their eyesight is simpler than many believe, they are still fascinating creatures, and there is still more to be discovered about them. These traits could make them either a loathed hitchhiking pest or a celebrated, powerful pet. The fact some of them can break aquarium glass, and their tendency to kill other aquarium animals, usually puts them firmly in the former category. Just as these pets enter the aquarium as larvae or hidden in shipments of coral, organisms from aquariums can enter the wild as aquarium waste. One of the most infamous examples are the cold water strains of Caulerpa taxifolia. A specialized, cold-resistant clone of the tropical algae was bred for use in aquariums. In 1984, they were released via aquarium waste from the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco, a European country on the Mediterranean Sea, roughly the size of Central Park. Similar strains are also released on the coast of California and South Australia. Upon release in Monaco, it quickly spread throughout the Mediterranean Sea via asexual reproduction, destroying native seagrass and algae beds, turning the ocean into a monotonous landscape. It is one of the worst invasive species in the world, and we will be discussing it in more detail in Episode 3, which covers the environmental cost of invasive species, and in Episode 5, which explores the ways people are trying to control this blight upon the oceans. Aquarium plants should be sealed in plastic bags before being placed in the garbage. This may be one of the only times where using a plastic bag is advisable for protecting the environment. In our next section, we're going to learn about fish farming. Aquariums for decoration and for hobbies aren't the only reasons humans transport and rear marine life. Aquaculture, the farming of aquatic life, has been practiced for thousands of years and is one of the world's most important and rapid-growing industries. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations released a report in 2016 titled State of the World Fisheries and Aquaculture. This report, which recorded data on seafood production and consumption up to 2014, highlights the importance of aquaculture. This report highlights the crucial importance of aquaculture for food security. As more fishermen catch less fish, aquaculture is picking up the slack and providing employment opportunity to millions of people worldwide, especially in the developing world. While older aquaculture methods focused on local species, Modern, industrialized aquaculture tends to focus on the most commercially valuable species, importing them if necessary. This not only ensures they will have a large profit, but also establish methods and procedures for raising the animals. One prime example of this is the Atlantic salmon Salmo salar. The species is native to the North Atlantic coasts of Europe and North America. Centuries of overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction lowered their wild populations, making them commercially extinct. In the 1970s, intensive aquaculture of Atlantic salmon began all over the world. They have now spread to other cold, temperate waters of the world, including Washington State, British Columbia, Chile, New Zealand, and Australia. A common way Atlantic salmon are farmed are in marine net pens. Marine net pens are large pens attached to buoys in the water, which fish are contained in. When these nets are damaged, salmon easily escape and swim into the water. Once introduced, they outcompete native fish for spawning grounds, transmit diseases, and spread parasites. In areas which have native Atlantic salmon, farmed salmon contaminate the gene pool and produce offspring with less fitness, threatening the species' long-term survival in the wild. There are many environmental concerns with the farming of Atlantic salmon in marine net pens. The salmon's waste pollutes the water with excessive nutrients, which can cause harmful algal blooms which create marine dead zones beneath the pens. Pesticides to kill sea lice and antibiotics used to control disease are also commonly used, especially to Chilean farmed Atlantic salmon. However, some farmers are working to improve their farms by using alternatives to pesticides or farming them in tanks on land instead. Marine net pens are also very vulnerable to predators, such as seabirds or marine mammals, and farmers will often kill marine mammals and seabirds which approach them in order to protect their fish. This can also lead to a possible biological invasion, because a damaged marine net pen can leak fish into the surrounding environment. Invasive mollusks have also spread via aquaculture. The farming of Pacific oysters spread them to nearly every coast in the northern hemisphere, where they outcompete native shellfish. Shipments of mollusks for aquaculture have also introduced hitchhiking invasive species, like how aquarium pests sneak into tanks and shipments of coral. Some examples of these species are Asian eelgrass and the Japanese oyster drill. Some of these invasive species threaten aquaculture operations themselves. The algae Codium fragile was introduced via shellfish imports, and its tendency to overgrow oyster beds gave it the nickname oyster thief. Some algae spread via oyster shipments by burying themselves in shells. Some algae, such as nori grown off the coast of Japan, have asexual stages in their life cycle where they bore into bivalve shells. This life cycle was discovered by botanist Kathleen Drew Baker, and it revolutionized nori aquaculture in Japan, turning what was once a luxury into a staple food crop. Now, Kathleen Drew Baker is honored by an annual holiday in Japan, and is given the title Mother of the Sea. In our next section, we're going to talk about environmentally irresponsible plant nurseries. Humans have always had a wide variety of uses for marine species, and in a globalized economy within a shrinking world, these uses offer even more opportunities for biological invasion. Similar to shipments of marine organisms for aquariums and aquaculture, bait shipments packed in seaweed offer opportunities for smaller organisms within the seaweed or the seaweed itself. This seaweed is often dumped into local waters after the bait is used, which could facilitate biological invasions. This is one of the reasons it is important for invasive species educational material to emphasize the role of invasive algae. The bait trade already led to the devastating introduction of the green crab to the Pacific coast of the United States. Scientific researchers also order and ship species so they can conduct experiments. Similar to other shipments of organisms, this too can lead to biological invasion. We'll be discussing how research transferred invasive species between hydrothermal vents later in this episode. Thankfully, biologists, being well aware of the risks of invasive species and concerned about potential loss of biodiversity, tend to be very careful on this issue. Wetland quote-unquote restoration, with an emphasis on air quotes, is another miscellaneous source of invasive species. Wetlands provide many important benefits to the environment. such as cleaning up pollution, providing habitat for wildlife, and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, despite the environmental, aesthetic, and health benefits of wetland restoration, the restoration process could end up introducing invasive species which harm the environment. For example, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers introduced the cordgrass Spartina alterniflora to California as part of a wetland restoration effort. Before widespread awareness of invasive species, landscapers and restorers planted vegetation based on functionality and appearance, not their geographical location. Now, restorers tend to be much more careful, but there are still nurseries in the United States which sell vegetation specifically for purposes of restoration and offer shipment to anywhere in the United States. For the third time, I'm not going to tell you where they are. For our next segment, we're going to discuss how one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century became one of the largest vectors for invasive species in the Mediterranean Sea. In the first part of this episode, we examined ways humans have intentionally transported organisms around the world on planes and ships. These transportation networks have also caused many unintentional biological invasions as invasive species hitched a ride or took advantage of a new avenue. One of the earliest forms of transportation in history are canals. They played an important role in transporting industrial products in Great Britain and in the United States, where they saw a massive expansion. In the United States, there are about 100 miles of canals at the start of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, there were about 4,000 miles of canals in the young nation, and they played a key role in developing the interior of the United States. One of these canals was the Erie Canal in New York State, which was completed in 1825 and connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie. This allowed not only for travel of barges, but opened up Lake Erie to one of the most devastating invasive species of the Great Lakes, the sea lamprey. Sea lamprey are primitive, jawless fish, which, like salmon, spawn upstream and normally live their adult lives in the ocean. They look like eels with doll-like eyes and a suction cup-shaped mouth lined with teeth, which makes them look like a monster from a science fiction film. While they won't be winning any beauty contests, they are still a fascinating snapshot into evolutionary history, providing biologists a glimpse of what the earliest fish might have looked like. Normally in the ocean, they are parasites, acting like a leech and eating the blood of their hosts. Most of their saltwater hosts adapted to lampreys and easily survive them. However, the freshwater fish of the Great Lakes do not have the mechanisms to survive a lamprey attack, and a lot of them die from their wounds. Since they kill their prey in the process of consuming them, this upgrades them from quote-unquote parasites to predators. This devastated the fish population of the Great Lakes, and in some years they killed more fish than commercial fishermen in the region. Thankfully, sea lampreys are an invasive species management success story, and we will be discussing this in Episode 5, which covers the management of invasive species. The invention and spread of railroads in the 19th century led to the decline of canals as a method of inland transportation. However, new industrial technology of the 19th century also saw the construction of new, powerful canals which could not just connect rivers, but entire oceans and seas. One of these was the Suez Canal in Egypt, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. The Suez Canal was completed in 1869, and it became an important trade route between Europe and Asia. Before the Suez Canal was constructed, a ship traveling from Europe to India would have to sail around the entire coast of Africa. Phineas Fogg, protagonist of Around the World in 80 Days, used the Suez Canal to bypass Africa, and without it, he probably would not have completed his journey on time. The Suez Canal's strategic importance was significant during both world wars, as it allowed Britain to connect India and Australia to fronts in Europe and the Mediterranean Sea. The Suez Canal is also one of the largest pathways for invasive species in the Mediterranean Sea, and according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, one of the most significant pathways of marine invasions globally. Since 1869, over 400 invasive species have been recorded to move into the Mediterranean Sea from the Red Sea via the Suez Canal, representing about half of total multicellular, non-indigenous species in the Mediterranean Sea. This is referred to as the quote-unquote Lessepian migration, named after Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French diplomat who organized the construction of the Suez Canal. The Mediterranean Sea ecosystem is one of the most imperiled by invasive species in the world. While Calair pataxifolia expanded from the west in Monaco, the effects of the Lessepian migration are most heavily felt in the eastern Mediterranean, on the coasts of Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and the Gaza Strip. Some of these species have had significant impacts on Mediterranean ecosystems. One example is the rabbitfish, an intense grazer of brown algae which can shift habitats from dense algal beds to barren rock. Another infamous species in the Lessepian migration is the nomad jellyfish. They are large jellyfish which can have a diameter of up to 1 meter. Native to the Indian Ocean, it was first reported off the Israeli coast in 1976, Lebanese coast in 1989, Turkish coast in 1995, and Syrian coast in 2002. They have annual swarms off the coast of Israel and Lebanon, where they clog fishing nets, ruin beaches, deliver painful stings requiring hospitalization, and even clog intake pipes of power plants. The Suez Canal is a more effective vector than the Panama Canal because it is a sea-level canal, which means it does not have locks to regulate water level. Water flows from the Red Sea into the Mediterranean Sea through currents. The Panama Canal is also less effective at transmitting invasive species because it is largely freshwater, preventing most marine species from traveling through it. On the opposite end of salinity, there are extremely saline, borderline uninhabitable patches of the Suez Canal, which prevented invaders from passing through. Unfortunately, the numerous expansions in width and depth of the Suez Canal undergone since its construction remove these saline patches, rendering it an even more effective route for invaders to access the Mediterranean Sea. In our next section, we're going to talk about one of the most famous methods of transporting invasive species, ballast water. Ballast water is one of the most effective long-distance vectors of marine species. Ballast water is water kept in large vessels, especially commercial ones, used to maintain stability, balance, and draft. The ballasting process starts in the source port, where water is loaded into a vessel while cargo is unloaded. As the empty vessel sails to its destination, it carries water from the source port inside of it. When cargo is loaded into it at the destination port, the ballast tanks are emptied. According to the International Maritime Organization, 10 billion tons of ballast water are transported every year. This is enough water to fill 4 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. They estimate this leads to 7,000 species transferred in ballast water every hour and every day, leading to one new invasion every 9 weeks. Planktonic organisms, or organisms with planktonic larvae, can travel very easily via ballast water. However, as we discussed in episode 1, there are lots of different factors, such as the environmental conditions of the habitat, which determine if an alien species becomes invasive. The most vulnerable habitats to biological invasion are ones with similar temperature regimes to the species' original habitat, such as between different oceans at similar latitudes or areas from different latitudes in the same ocean. For example, shipping brought the North Pacific sea star, native to cold regions of the North Pacific, to colder regions on the coast of southern Australia. Ballast water transported the green crab, native to cold European waters, to southern Australia and the U.S. East Coast. Asian kelp, Undaria pinnatifida, a common part of Japanese cuisine, has spread via ballast water to New Zealand, Australia, the Mediterranean Sea, Great Britain, Argentina, Mexico, and the United States. Ballast water is first introduced among British coal transport vessels in the 1850s, and would move into widespread use in the 1870s, about when Around the World in 80 Days is set. The potential for ballast water as a transportation mechanism for plankton was first acknowledged in the 1890s. The first recorded instance of planktonic transport happened in 1903, when a diatom from the Indo-Pacific region called Odontella sinensis was discovered in the Skagerrak Strait between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In 1909, it was also discovered in the English Channel. Invasive species traveling via ballast water would not receive widespread attention until 1985, when Dr. James Carleton published a comprehensive review of ballast water biology titled Transoceanic and Interoceanic Dispersal of Coastal Marine Ecosystems, Biology of Ballast Water. This paper is very important in the history of invasion biology, and inspired many other researchers to conduct similar research. In the 1980s and 1990s, several malignant, high-profile biological invasions occurred by ballast water, increasing attention from both the public and scientific community. Some examples include the introduction of the comb jelly Meniopsis ligii to the Black Sea, the dreaded zebra mussel to the Great Lakes, an epidemic cholera. These species had devastating economic impacts, which will be discussed in Episode 4, which will cover the economic and human costs of invasive species. In order to prevent more biological invasions, Dr. Carleton spent about 15 years testifying before the United States Congress and advising federal agencies on how to prevent biological invasions. In the 1980s and 1990s, invasive species received more public attention thanks to awareness campaigns, and more countries passed laws designed to prevent biological invasions. However, with the incomprehensible volume of ballast water transported across the world every day, these laws may not be enough to prevent devastating biological invasions. Since the 1980s, Dr. James Carleton has become one of the world's most renowned marine ecologists, founding editor-in-chief of the international journal Biological Invasions, a faculty member at Williams College, and is currently the director of the Maritime Studies program at Williams College, Mystic Seaport in Mystic, Connecticut. In our next section, we'll be discussing another fascinating part of Dr. Carleton's research, how invasive species surfed across the ocean on a tsunami. In recent years, marine debris have been receiving increased public attention. Graphic videos and photographs of sea turtles with straws in their noses, pilot whales with intact bags of laundry detergent pods in their stomach, and decaying albatrosses on the remote Midway Atoll with stomachs filled with plastic have brought public attention to this important conservation issue. However, tragic injuries of charismatic wildlife are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of environmental threats posed by marine debris. Plastic builds up in commercially valuable fish, making them inedible to humans. Dilute persistent pollutants like DDT concentrate on microscopic pieces of plastic, posing a threat to environmental and human health decades after they were banned. Another important, often overlooked issue regarding marine debris is the transportation of invasive species. Natural marine debris like driftwood and seaweed have been transporting marine organisms for millions of years before humans evolved. Scientists refer to this as transoceanic rafting, and it is very important in marine ecology and biogeography. However, anthropogenic marine debris, such as plastic, ships, and concrete structures, is more effective at transporting invasive species than natural debris. Unlike trees and logs, they are not vulnerable to destruction by wood-eating shipworms. One of the most dramatic examples of transoceanic rafting on artificial materials is tsunami debris. In 2011, a devastating 9.0 magnitude earthquake and 39-meter-tall tsunami struck the Tohoku region on the northeastern coast of Honshu, scattering debris across the Pacific Ocean. About 1 year later, millions of pieces of Japanese debris, including entire docks and vessels, started washing up across the Pacific Ocean. Currents distributed this debris wide, delivering flotsam to Midway Island, Hawaii, Alaska, California, and Oregon. Alarmingly, many pieces of debris were covered by colonies of marine organisms. Dr. James Carlton and a team of other biologists studied the organisms transported on this debris for 6 years, releasing the paper Tsunami-Driven Rafting, Transoceanic Species Dispersal and Implications for Marine Biogeography. Their study revealed 289 species of living Japanese invertebrates on debris from the 2011 tsunami, some of which was still washing ashore 6 years after the disaster. This was very surprising for researchers. There are no previous examples of coastal organisms surviving longer than 2 years while rafting. Alarmingly, one of the species transported by the tsunami was the North Pacific sea star, which caused severe damage and was introduced to Australia via ballast water. Thanks to the work of volunteers who scraped and burned the tsunami debris, there were no recorded examples of invasive species traveling on tsunami debris establishing themselves in North America. However, these are just the recorded examples. It is very easy for an introduced species to sneak through the cracks and become invasive. The Tohoku region was hit by tsunamis of comparable size in 1896 and 1933, but there were no records of Japanese debris arriving in the Pacific Northwest. This is mainly because of two reasons. First, the region was more rural at the time, so there were less debris to carry. Second, plastic had not been in widespread use at the time. Many vessels washing up on Oregon were made of fiberglass, which was invented in 1936. A lot of debris, including the Miwasa docks, included polyester foam, which wasn't available until the 1940s. Since plastics entered mainstream use in the 1950s, an unfathomable amount of them have entered the ocean. The term plastic pollution is sometimes used by scientists and conservationists in lieu of marine debris because of the stronger connotations of the term plastic pollution. Plastic is a particularly dangerous form of marine debris because it does not exist in nature or biodegrade. Similar to other artificial habitats like piers, oil derricks, and shipwrecks, floating collections of plastic become colonized by marine organisms. These collections of plastic are referred to as plastic spheres. They are first colonized by a diverse array of microbes, including bacteria which can cause cholera. Eventually, they form a microbial community distinct from the surrounding seawater, which floats through the ocean. The study, Leave No Traces, Beach Litter, Marine Litter Shelters Both Invasive Native Species, found evidence of multicellular invasive species reaching the Baltic Sea on plastic spheres. With coastal communities increasingly under threat by stronger storms, sea level rise, and coastal flooding, more destructive incidents on the scale of the Tohoku tsunami will provide invasive species with more opportunity to ride across our oceans on dizzying deluges of deleterious debris. However, it's not just mundane materials which can serve as vectors for marine species. In our next section, we're going to discuss how high-tech research equipment was able to bring invasive species to one of the world's most remote habitats. In 1864, Jules Verne wrote the novel Journey to the Center of the Earth, which depicted extinct creatures like pterosaurs, plesiosaurs, and giant ground sloths living deep underground. So this trope of rare, massive prehistoric animals like plesiosaurs or dinosaurs surviving to the present day in remote locations would later inspire other authors and filmmakers. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote The Lost World in 1912, which depicts dinosaurs surviving on a large remote plateau in the Amazon rainforest. However, the idea of secluded ecosystems of prehistoric creatures surviving on the frontiers of human knowledge isn't confined to science fiction. In 1977, the RSV Alvin, a research submersible operated by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, made a completely unprecedented discovery off of the Galapagos Islands. The explorers discovered hydrothermal vents, chimney-like structures which released a stew of boiling hot toxic chemicals into the water. Despite the complete lack of sunlight, crushing water pressure, and water temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Celsius, the boiling point of water, life thrives here. Chemosynthetic bacteria use chemicals in hydrothermal fluid to turn carbon dioxide into energy. Some of these bacteria form symbiotic relationships with multicellular organisms, such as tube worms and clams, which are eaten by other animals like crabs and shrimp. A productive, thriving, diverse ecosystem of unique, specially adapted animals thrives in the hydrothermal vents, making scientists at the time reconsider the previously held belief that the sun was needed for life. Most amazingly, there is strong evidence these ecosystems have changed little for millions of years. 95% of hydrothermal vent species are only found in hydrothermal vents. Fossils of Mesozoic-era hydrothermal vent ecosystems are remarkably similar to their modern forms. Remarkably, vent species in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are very close to each other, despite the vast isolation of the vents. The entire ecosystem is effectively a quote-unquote living fossil, which, like the shark, crocodilian, and sturgeon, have changed little since the time of the dinosaurs. It's a real-life quote-unquote lost world stranger than anything Sir Arthur Conan Doyle could have imagined. While the extreme conditions and isolated locations of this habitat make it very difficult to invade, hydrothermal vents are not immune. Most hydrothermal vents are only accessible by specialized deep-sea submersibles. Even then, there are extreme differences in temperature and pressure between different hydrothermal vents, which would surely kill any hitchhiking vent fauna. Scientists from Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History disproved this hypothesis when they used a submersible Alvin to collect hydrothermal vent species from the Juan de Fuca Ridge in the Pacific Ocean. Among their samples, they discovered 38 limpets of the species Lepidodrilus gordensis, which are only known to be from the Gorda Ridge, 635 kilometers south of the collection site. Upon testing in the lab, the scientists discovered the limpets had the same DNA, morphology, and bacteria colonies as limpets from the Gorda Ridge, which Alvin visited 36 hours earlier. The scientists who discovered this potential invasion warned against future invasions in the paper Scientific Gear as a Vector for Non-Native Species at Deep-Sea Hydrothermal Vents. The paper's abstract reads, "Our failure to completely clean the gear on the subsea vehicle meant we could have introduced the species and any disease it carried to a novel location. Our findings suggest that the nearly inaccessible biological communities at deep-sea vents may be vulnerable to anthropogenic alteration, despite their severe physical limitations." While there is risk from scientific equipment, biologists tend to value biodiversity and avoid harming ecosystems during their studies. However, while visits to hydrothermal vents so far have been almost exclusively by scientists or documentarians, depleting mineral deposits in the surface are bringing a new group to the hydrothermal vents, deep-sea miners. If Alvin was able to bring invasive species to different sites in the deep sea, there is no doubt in my mind that deep-sea mining will facilitate biological invasions in the deep sea, one of the most wondrous and unexplored ecosystems on Earth. In the next section, we're going to discuss how climate change impacted the waters around one of the colleges I applied for. Climate change is detrimental to many marine species. However, while these species are threatened by climate change, other species stand to benefit. Unfortunately, they tend to be the invasive ones. As we've discussed earlier, invasive species tend to be able to handle a wider variety of temperatures and be more resilient to rapid changes of them. The study, Linking Climate Change and Biological Invasions, Ocean Warming Facilitates Non-Indigenous Species Invasions, shows how even slight changes in temperature can facilitate a biological invasion. The study was done in Groton, Connecticut, at the University of Connecticut's Avery Point campus, one of the colleges I applied to. The study observed ascidians, or sea squirts, which settled near the campus. These sea squirts are sessile animals which settle in early spring and late winter. In the studied years, 1991 to 2002, there is a strong correlation between abundance of invasive sea squirts and milder winters. Even the slightest change in winter temperatures gave these invasive species the opportunity to colonize the area, meaning even minor changes in climate could lead to significant impacts on the environment. On the other side of America, the study Ocean Warming Increases Threat of Invasive Species in Marine Fouling Community tested the impact of more severe climate change on invasive species in Bodega Bay, California. The scientists manipulated the temperature of aquaria in the laboratory to simulate ambient temperature and increased ocean temperatures predicted by ocean warming scenarios. The experimental temperatures were increased by 3.5 degrees Celsius, or 38.3 degrees Fahrenheit, and 4 degrees Celsius, or 39.2 degrees Fahrenheit. The abstract of the paper states, first, we determined that introduced species tolerated significantly higher temperatures than natives, suggesting that climate change will have a disproportionately negative impact on native species. The paper predicts that, as ocean temperatures increase, native species will decrease in abundance, whereas introduced species are likely to increase in this system. Facilitation of invasions by climate change may already be underway. Locally, invasive dominance has increased concurrent with ocean warming over the past approximately 40 years. Both of these studies focused on fouling communities, marine organisms which settle on man-made structures such as docks, piers, shipwrecks, and the hulls of vessels. Fouling organisms tend to be either sessile or, in the case of mussels, very slow-moving. We are going to explore the impacts of fouling communities further in Episode 4, which covers the economic cost of invasive species. As we see here, climate change harms biodiversity, not only by making it more difficult for native species to survive, but by making it easier for invasive species to thrive. One particularly infamous invasive species which poises to thrive immensely from climate change, Pterois volitans, otherwise known as the lionfish. Earlier in this episode, we discussed how the lionfish spread to the Atlantic Ocean via the pet trade. Since then, it has rapidly spread throughout the Caribbean Sea and Western Atlantic, as far north as Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. The only thing holding it back is cold ocean water, and as that warms, it gives the lionfish more room and space to thrive. Warmer ocean waters also make them grow faster in their planktonic larval stage, increasing their already astronomical reproductive rate. In our next section, we'll go over how climate change impacts the range of other fish, which in turn impacts adorable puffins. On a small scale, climate change can make invasive species dominate in coastal areas. While plants are the primary producers of terrestrial ecosystems, phytoplankton form the bottom of the food chain in marine ecosystems. The journal title, Mismatch Between Marine Plankton Range Movements and the Velocity of Climate Change, published in Nature Communications, compared data from 148,000 samples across an ocean basin over a 60-year period. The average range movement for broadly tolerant plankton was 7 kilometers per decade. The average movement for less tolerant plankton was 99 kilometers per decade. Some plankton species even moved 900 kilometers during a recent warming period. With few exceptions, marine ecosystems are rooted in plankton. When plankton move, fish follow. This leads to fish entering new ranges where they could become an invasive species. One high-profile example of this is the migration of the Atlantic cod, Gadus morhua, into the Arctic Ocean. To say the Atlantic cod is commercially important is an understatement. This is possibly the most important fish in human history, and the fishing of them helped build New England. I further explore the fascinating history of Atlantic cod in my additional podcast, The End of the Line. Cod stocks collapsed in the 1990s, which is attributed both to centuries of overfishing and warming oceans. In recent years, Atlantic cod and Atlantic haddock have been migrating from the Atlantic Ocean into the Arctic Ocean, into the range of Arctic cod. Fortunately, there is little competition between the two species, since less than 40% of their diet overlaps. However, Atlantic cod are voracious predators, and increased migration of them into the Arctic cod's range may threaten the future of Arctic cod. All organisms are connected, and a shift in one will affect many others. One particularly sad example of this is the decline of the Atlantic puffin colony on the island of Rost in the Norwegian Sea. For years, puffins migrated to this island and to raise their chicks, which are called pufflings, a name as ridiculously cute as their fluffy, downy appearance. For years, puffin mothers and fathers would feed their chicks small herring which swam off of Rost. These herring ate mackerel. With a warming ocean, there was less plankton for mackerel, so they migrated north. The small herring followed the mackerel. Puffins need to feed pufflings small fish because they eat them whole. Without the small herring, parents could not feed their chicks, and they abandoned them, leaving the small, vulnerable pufflings to die a slow, miserable death of starvation. In 1979, there were about 1.5 million mating pairs on the island of Rost. In 2014, there were less than 400,000. I want to emphasize that these changes to the puffin colonies of Rost are happening now. The frightening scenarios of significant temperature increases will have even more serious impacts on plankton and the entire biosphere. In our next section, we're going to talk about the insane insurance policies of a record-breaking cruise ship on Earth's last frontiers. One of the most conspicuous, obvious, and famous examples of the effects of climate change is the melting of the polar ice caps. This melting in the Arctic Circle has created a quote-unquote Northwest Passage in Canada, which ships can travel through without the escort of an icebreaker. Like how the Suez Canal allowed ships to bypass Africa, and the Panama Canal allowed them to bypass South America, this new Northwest Passage will allow ships to sail between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without the Panama Canal. As of 2016, the largest ship which traveled through the Northwest Passage was the Crystal Serenity, a luxurious 813-foot cruise liner which traveled from Anchorage, Alaska to New York City. Of course, it required $50,000 emergency evacuation insurance policies in addition to the price of the ticket, the lowest of which was $22,000. The voyage included a stopover in a remote Inuit village in the Northwest Territories, where passengers on the ship outnumbered the local Inuit 4-1. Tourists aren't the only people sailing through the Northwest Passage. The melting sea ice has opened new opportunities for commercial shipping and oil exploitation in the region. I really don't have a lot of words to describe what sort of borderline large-scale suicidal mindset is required to think we should start risky oil drilling adventures because the polar ice caps melted. More vessel traffic and movement of equipment in the region will provide more opportunities for invasive species via the methods we discussed earlier in this episode, traveling in ballast water and hitchhiking by attaching themselves to hulls and equipment, or on the increased amounts of marine debris associated with maritime activity. The fascinating marine ecosystems of the Arctic Circle extend beyond immediately charismatic marine mammals like polar bears, beluga whales, narwhals, and walruses. The Arctic seafloor, or benthos, is filled with a wide variety of large, fascinating invertebrates and fish fed by algae living in the ice. All of this is in serious risk, not only from declining ice, but also from the introduction of potentially catastrophic invasive species. Fortunately, like deep-sea mining, this is very new activity, and there are opportunities to prevent extensive damage caused by invasive species. Arctic Invasive Alien Species Strategy and Action Plan 2017, a document produced by the Arctic Council, has this to say. Although changing climatic conditions and a growing interest in resource extraction, settlement, and tourism are making the Arctic region particularly vulnerable to biological invasion, There is an immediate opportunity, already lost in many other regions of the world, to proactively build resilience to the risks posed by invasive alien species in the Arctic's unique ecological, social, and economic systems. In our next section, we are going to the other side of the world to explore a lost world which may soon be lost forever. While the Arctic Circle has a rich benthos, or seafloor, animal community, it is poor compared to the wonders at the bottom of Antarctica's seas. Antarctica has far more endemism, the presence of unique species, than the Arctic. The Antarctic benthos fauna meaning animals, are a poorly studied, little understood community resting on the deep waters of Antarctica's continental shelf. These organisms were isolated by frigid currents, which surround the entire continent. This frigid environment is too harsh for most durophagous, or crushing predators, such as bony fish, chimera, sharks, and crabs. Instead, most of the predators in this ecosystem are slow-moving invertebrates like sea spiders. Similar to chubby birds and isolated islands, the Antarctic benthos fauna evolved into unique, beautiful, and fascinating forms in the absence of durophagous predators. It's an even more fitting example of a lost world than the hydrothermal vents. It's a part of the seas that time forgot, resembling what the ocean looked like before jawed fish evolved. Without having to worry about tearing teeth or claws, the ecosystem is dominated by soft-bodied organisms which defy description or imagination. Unique, gorgeous soft corals, bryozoans, hydroids, and glass sponges carpet the seafloor in extreme densities, like corals on a healthy reef in shallower water. In some areas, there are over 155,000 animals per square meter. As good as I am with descriptions, I still struggle to put its beauty into words. In the description of this podcast, I'll be attaching a link to a video from the Australian Antarctic Survey, which shows some examples of footage taken on a research dive. Sadly, the frigid barriers which once held back the hordes of crabs and sharks from annihilating this ecosystem are fading as the ocean warms. Without this barrier, there is little stopping modern predators from taking advantage of this archaic prey. The rare soft-bodied fauna will be reduced to nothing in a flurry of teeth and claws. This lost world, a glimpse back in time, will be brought to the modern age. I happen to be an invertebrate lover, and the loss of this invertebrate biodiversity, before it can even be properly studied, saddens me. Even sadder is that, outside of some people in the scientific community, and activists fighting to protect the fragile beauty of the Antarctic, it will be, almost entirely, unmourned, as unknown in death as it was in life. As humans shrank the world with railways, long-distance ships, and airplanes, they developed many means for people, ideas, and invasive species to travel all over the world, from the shallow waters of the New England coast to the remote, unknown depths of hydrothermal vents. Exotic species were intentionally introduced to new areas, opportunistic species took advantage of new routes, and small plankton hitched rides across the globe in ballast water. Now, the oil, coal, and natural gas humans burned to shrink the world is altering ecosystems in dramatic ways, giving new advantages and altering the ranges of invasive species. In the next episode, we will explore the numerous ways these invaders harm the environment, from excessive predation on naive species to the collapse of entire ecosystems. This is the Walden Watch signing off, and remember, always stay vigilant.